The concept of challenge in speedruns is one that is somewhat strange. It's easy to think of games that are notoriously difficult, but all speedruns are fairly difficult due to their competitive nature. This means a game which is innately challenging may not necessarily have a difficult speedrun. This conversation becomes further muddled when you consider movement options, techniques which are optional, glitches, sequence breaks, and it goes on. So for this video, I want to explore two games whose speedrun and base game have wildly different levels of difficulty in order to explore why challenge is such a slippery and miasmic concept. An obvious place to start are games which are designed for difficulty, as they can give us an idea of what works and what doesn't. There are several games and mods which exist already which are designed for the express purpose of being ridiculously difficult and challenging. But for this segment, I'm going to be specifically referencing Kaizo Mario World as it's one of the best known and most familiar examples. Kaizo Mario and many other Mario mods are difficult for sure, but they just feel so arbitrary. The things that are awesome about these mods are the difficult timing and precise inputs needed to do some of the platforming. But those things are just few and far between, and the vast majority of the challenge of this game just feels like gotchas aimed at casual players or overexcited, ragey YouTubers. For example, in this segment, there's only really one safe spot on screen. If you don't know where that spot is, you could spend a solid 15 minutes trying to carefully navigate between the iron balls, but the solution is actually pretty simple. And in all this, I'm not trying to disrespect the runners for these games, because I know that it would definitely be impossible for me to even beat this game, let alone speedrun it, but that's kind of my point. The game is incredibly difficult, frustrating, and nearly impossible to beat for casual players, but most of the difficulty is artificial. Take the final boss fight with Bowser as an example. The majority of the difficulty comes from the realization that the ads he spawns are invisible, as is Bowser himself. There is some difficulty in reacting to Bowser's appearances, and the fire that falls is a moderate challenge as well, I guess. For a conventional player, this would take a long time to beat, as you need to realize where Bowser is when he's invisible, but speedrunners know where he'll appear from experience, so this incredibly challenging mod just becomes boring in the final minutes when it should be fully testing the runner's skill, with a bullet hell-esque segment which tests reactions and techniques when instead it's just this. This trend of impossible for casuals, difficult for speedrunners is pretty common throughout these games and mods, but in my opinion, it misses the point. Rather than being a game that is phenomenal and challenging for speedrunning specifically, it's just nearly impossible if you don't speedrun the game. And that brings me to my next example of a game whose conventional difficulty doesn't quite match its speedrun difficulty, but in a much different way. Dark Souls, specifically the original edition of the first game. Dark Souls is a bit of an oddity as far as challenging speedruns go. The base game is challenging for sure, but far from impossible. A conventional player can keep throwing themselves at the game over and over and eventually beat it. Difficult bosses combined with the necessity for smart play mean that most players who beat the game will do so very slowly over a long period of time. However, the speedrun is a bit different. On paper, it seems like it should be easier. Glitched weapons allow runners to kill bosses which normally take several minutes in several seconds, and wrong warps allow runners to skip entire segments of the game and arrive directly at the final boss area way earlier than a conventional player could. This makes the game seem like it would be a cakewalk. The majority of the game is fine-tuned around player damage versus enemy health, so increasing player damage values should make the game, and by extension the speedrun, much easier as the player gets more and more glitched and broken. But that assumption is entirely incorrect. Yes, the game becomes easier, but that's inconsequential. The game being easier doesn't make the speedrun any easier because the runner's goal isn't to beat the game, it's to beat the game quickly. This aspect of speed raises the stakes because while runners might be able to glitch their weapons, they can't glitch their armor or survivability. In the world of Dark Souls, the slightest mistake means death, and while conventional players might die and be fine as long as they can get their souls back, speedrunners don't have this luxury. Soul count is heavily monitored till nearly the end of the run, and dying once means losing upwards of several minutes on your run, if not ending it entirely. While conventional players have the luxury of armor and rings and gallons of Estus, speedrunners don't have this either. Runners do the entire run naked as armor simply slows them down, and Estus is largely unneeded as runners die in one hit to any enemy after the Undead Asylum. All of these factors mean that the Dark Souls speedrun is simultaneously more difficult than conventional play, while being easier in some regard due to the presence of glitches. While the innate challenge of Dark Souls proper is centered around difficult combat and punishing bosses, the speedrun doesn't share this innate challenge, but that doesn't make it any less challenging. Compare this to Kaizo Mario, where speedrunning the game arguably makes the game easier, at least in some regard. The competitiveness of speedrunning is what truly makes a difficult speedrun difficult. And while Kaizo Mario is arguably affected by this, the connection is fairly vague. Yes, the stakes are higher because in order to get a world record run, almost all of the tricks need to be performed perfectly. But this difficulty is artificial and honestly arbitrary. In Dark Souls, the competition might be fierce, but there's a lot more going on that makes it a challenging game, especially in the mechanics. Speaking of which, let's discuss that, as we haven't even gotten to the concept of movement options or technical skill. While movement options don't really apply to either of these examples, techniques are another area where these games differ from casual or novice speedrun play. Again, I'll use Dark Souls as an example compared to Kaizo Mario. There are several different techniques used throughout the Dark Souls speedrun, but I'm going to focus specifically on move swapping in order to save us all some time. Move swapping is a technique which allows players to dual wield the weapon in their left hand through buffering some menu actions. I don't know the specifics well, so I won't attempt to go into detail, but in essence, it puts the moveset of the weapon in your right hand onto the weapon in your left hand, which very quickly breaks the game. The actual act of move swapping is fairly difficult and takes a while to learn, however, veteran runners have to do it on the fly in order to optimize movement fully. Wearing armor makes move swapping much easier as it gives more time to buffer the necessary inputs. However, veteran runners need to save every second that they can, so all do it naked, which is much more difficult. Using armor is helpful for novice runners, however, as it allows them to more easily get a feel for it in practice. Meanwhile, conventional players just playing through on their own will probably never use move swapping at all, as it's a glitch and most players view using those conventionally as cheating, which I guess is valid. This is a good example of a technique adding challenge, but eventually that challenge is lessened, as even the most difficult techniques will eventually become easy with practice. A conventional player will never use the technique at all and can progress without it. A novice can use handicaps that are not efficient, but help them practice in order to reduce the difficulty. And then finally, a veteran will do the technique without any handicaps, without even a second thought. This is an ideal example of how technique-based challenge should work in a speedrun, with the challenge itself bending to the needs of the player. However, and I hate to keep dogging on Kaizo Mario, but it handles this concept very poorly. I've already admitted that sections that are tests of skill indeed do require vast amount of skill and knowledge, but they're less of a challenge and more simply difficult. For example, this section where the runner must use a spin jump to navigate on these bullet bills over this gap while avoiding damage. This is an obvious challenge, right? You have hazards, an obvious goal, and it requires skill to get past, and that's totally correct. Yeah, it's a challenge, but it isn't necessarily challenging. The problem is that there's only really one way through. A conventional player will complete this section the same way as a novice runner would, who will complete it the same way a veteran runner would, albeit faster. While Dark Souls move swap glitch is an ever-changing graph of difficulty where learning how to do some aspect of it well simply means that you have a more challenging aspect ahead, vast majority of Kaizo Mario challenges act more like a checklist. You either use a spin jump to get over this pit, or you don't get over it. You either get to this mushroom block to open a path quickly enough, or you don't and you die. Other than a few sparse segments, there's only one or two ways to complete every challenge throughout the game, which means the only difference between a novice runner and an expert is how consistently they can do all 137 arbitrary challenges until the end of the run. I realize that these games have vastly different types of challenge and gameplay, but that's sort of the point. Kaizo Mario was designed in order to be challenging, difficult, frustrating experience, and to be nearly impossible to beat. But the speedrun just completely breaks that. Meanwhile, Dark Souls was designed to be punishing, yes, but in the end it was designed by an artist who intended for people to beat his game. This is why challenge in speedrunning is such a miasmic concept. It really connects to a larger theme of challenge in game design and gaming as a whole, and how most challenge is centered around a casual player playing through the game a single time. However, this video is already over long, so I'll save that for another day. I do want to reiterate here at the end that I have nothing but respect for the Kaizo Mario speedrunners and runners of any other similar game. They are incredibly skilled and well practiced, and my dislike for the game does not mean that I dislike its players. My goal is not to drag them or their accomplishments through the mud, but to showcase what I feel is a good example between artificial difficulty and realized difficulty. Either way, thanks for sticking with me and watching this video. Let me know down below what you guys think of challenge in speedrunning or about other games that handle challenge in an interesting way. If you'd like to support me in this channel, please consider sharing with others and subscribing, but it's okay if you don't. Simply watching through a video this long shows your support, and I really appreciate it. So, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.